Okay, so welcome everyone. Today we're doing a deep dive into something, pretty mind-bending.
Absolutely. We're looking at ideas that challenge some really fundamental assumptions about reality, life,
Mm.
even death.
Yeah, we're drawing from sources discussing the work of physicist Thomas Campbell and the scientist Robert Lanza.
And these sources, they lay out this really radical shared premise. What if consciousness isn't just, a side effect of your brain?
What if it's primary, like the source of reality?
Exactly. And if that's the case, maybe death isn't really an end. Maybe it's more of a transition.
So that's our goal today, right? To really unpack these ideas, look at the evidence, the sources present, and just explore what it all might mean for you.
Let's start with that core idea then, because it really is paradigm shifting.
Great. The central argument in these sources is that reality at its base isn't physical, not made of tiny bits of stuff.
Instead, consciousness is the foundation. The physical world we experience, it actually rises from consciousness.
Now, it's important to say this isn't the mainstream scientific view currently.
No, definitely not. But the sources emphasize that the people proposing this, Campbell and Lanza, they come from scientific backgrounds. Campbell's a physicist, Lanza's background is in biology, medicine. He's quite recognized.
So they're approaching this from a scientific mindset, even if the conclusions are unconventional.
Right. And the big flip is this. It's not the universe containing life. It's life, or consciousness, that contains the universe.
Consciousness isn't just some emergent property of brain cells firing,
No, the sources describe it as the fundamental fabric itself.
which, if you think about it, completely changes your place in the cosmos, doesn't it?
It really does. You're not just a biological machine wandering through a physical world. Your consciousness interacting with, well, something described very differently.
Okay, let's dig into Thomas Campbell's model first, his my big toe theory.
Right. Campbell's perspective, as laid out in the sources, models reality as essentially a highly advanced virtual reality, a kind of multiplayer digital simulation.
A simulation, so like a video game.
In a way, yeah. And in this model, you are the consciousness, the player, if you like. You're non-physical.
So my thoughts, my memories, my choices. That's not happening in my physical brain.
According to this model, no. That's happening at the level of consciousness, which is sort of outside or behind the simulation. The brain is part of the interface.
The interface, meaning the body.
Exactly. The physical body is described as your avatar. It's the temporary vehicle you use to interact within this virtual reality.
And the brain.
The brain is presented as part of that avatar system, a complex biological computer maybe, but not the source of your awareness. The sources even suggest it might only be fully rendered computationally when needed.
Like when a surgeon opens a skull.
Sort of, yeah. It highlights the idea that the underlying reality is informational, not physical in the way we assume.
Wow. Okay, so this simulation, this virtual reality, it's part of something bigger.
Yes, Campbell called it the larger consciousness system, or LCS. It's described as an informational system, not a physical place. And
Yeah.
crucially, we're not separate observers looking at it.
We're in it, participants.
We're participants, yeah. Fully immersed.
And how does this system generate reality? The sources mentioned it's efficient.
Incredibly efficient, apparently. Like a game engine. The LCS renders reality based on demand, based on what your consciousness the player is observing or interacting with.
So if I look at the stars,
The system computes that data stream for your avatar. When you look away, that specific computation, that data stream, might stop or change.
that sounds a bit like the observer effect in quantum physics.
It does provide a potential explanation for it, yes. The idea that reality needs an observer to collapse into a definite state.
Okay, so if we're consciousness in the simulation, interacting via avatars, how do we influence things?
Through your choices and responses, that's the data you send back into the system. And the sources really stress the importance of intent.
Intent, not just the action.
Right. The why behind the action matters. Two similar actions, one driven by fear, one by compassion, could have very different effects on your future probabilities within the system.
So the system is tracking our motivations.
In essence, yes. It
Yeah.
tracks intent and patterns. The sources suggest it provides stability when your choices align with growth, like becoming more aware, more caring.
And if they don't, if they come from fear or ego,
Then the system adjusts the simulation to provide feedback. You might experience more confusion, conflict, maybe recurring difficult situations.
like repeating the same relationship, mistakes, or arguments.
Exactly. It's described not as punishment, but as feedback, a signal that an internal pattern hasn't shifted offering another chance to respond differently, to learn.
And this feedback, it can take time.
It can be immediate or it can play out over years, according to Campbell's model. It's about the long-term evolution of your consciousness.
What about free will? Are we just puppets in the simulation?
No, the sources state free will is absolutely fundamental. Without genuine choice, there's no learning, no evolution.
So our choices really matter.
Especially the ones made under uncertainty, they suggest. Those choices reveal your core quality of consciousness. Awareness, time, free will, they're seen as deeply interconnected.
Okay, so what about death in this model? If consciousness isn't the body?
Death is simply logging out, exiting the avatar, disconnecting from this specific virtual reality simulation.
And consciousness itself continues?
Yes, it returns to the broader LCS, processes the life experience, the data gathered.
And then reincarnation.
Maybe re-engages later in a new scenario, a new avatar for further growth. But it's described as an iterative learning process. Based on processing the previous run, not just random, it's about evolving consciousness.
Can you access other parts of this system, this LCS, without dying?
Campbell suggests yes. Things like near-death experiences, out-of-body states, deep meditation, even dreams. There might be glimpses.
Glimpses.
Moments where the data stream shifts or consciousness temporarily accesses information from other levels or probabilities within the LCS, not just hallucinations.
He did experiments on this.
Apparently, yes. In altered states, finding consistent results that seemed non-physical, supporting his model. The idea is that even paths not taken, potential realities, exist as probability data in the system and can sometimes be perceived.
Like seeing a different version of your life.
Potentially, yeah, as a form of feedback or a broader understanding. It's a complex, information-rich model of reality.
It really is. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Robert Lanza. The sources highlight his scientific credentials quite a bit.
They do. Cloning, stem cells, recognition from major publications. He comes at this from a biology and physics angle.
But arrives at a similar conclusion about consciousness.
Remarkably similar in the fundamentals. His view, called biocentrism, also posits that consciousness isn't generated by the brain.
It's the other way around.
Yes, the brain, the body, space, time, all of it arises from consciousness. The universe exists within life, within consciousness.
Okay, another total flip of the usual picture. Where does he find scientific support?
He points heavily towards modern physics. Quantum mechanics and relativity are key for Lanza's arguments.
The observer effect again.
Definitely. The fact that particles seem to exist only as probabilities until observed. The act of conscious observation appears necessary to bring reality into a definite state.
The sources used an example. The kitchen.
Right. You assume your kitchen is just there, solid and colored, even when you're not in it. But Lanza argues the perceived reality, the shapes, the colors, requires your consciousness interacting with reflected light. Light itself isn't colored.
And the quantum part
is that the very particles making up the stove only settle into definite positions when observed. Before that, they're just probabilities. So your consciousness observing is what collapses those probabilities into the solid kitchen you experience.
Wow. So my consciousness is, in a sense, co-creating my kitchen.
That's the implication of biocentrism, yes. And relativity adds another layer. Relativity shows time isn't absolute. Past, present, future aren't fixed like we feel them. Lanza describes space and time as tools of the mind, constructs consciousness uses to organize experience, not external containers.
So they aren't fundamental reality.
They're fundamental to our experience of reality, but perhaps not fundamental to reality itself. They are perceptual tools.
What's the brain's job in this biocentrism model, then, if it's not creating consciousness?
It's seen more like a receiver or a filter. It tunes consciousness into this specific spatio-temporal reality, rather than generating it from scratch.
Which helps explain
the hard problem of consciousness, maybe. How does subjective feeling, the redness of red, the taste of salt, arise from purely physical stuff like neurons? If the brain is a receiver, consciousness itself holds the qualia of the experience.
And when the receiver breaks, when the body dies,
the signal consciousness doesn't cease to exist. It just detaches from that particular biological filter. The awareness continues, just not through that specific brain-body channel.
The sources bring up evidence here too, right? For consciousness surviving brain death.
Absolutely. Near-death experiences, NDEs, are a major point. Studies by researchers like Parnia and Grayson.
These are cases where people were clinically dead, no heartbeat, no brain activity.
Yes, flatlined EEG in some cases. Yet they report vivid, clear, structured conscious experiences, often feeling hyper-real.
And sometimes they recall things they shouldn't have been able to perceive.
Exactly. Verifiable details about procedures, conversations, events happening sometimes even outside the room while they were clinically dead. These accounts are consistent across cultures, too. Hard to explain if consciousness is just brain activity.
And then there's terminal lucidity.
Right, another fascinating phenomenon discussed. Patients with severe brain damage, like late-stage Alzheimer's.
Their brains are significantly deteriorated.
Massively. Yet shortly before death, some experience a sudden, unexpected return to complete clarity, recognizing family, speaking coherently.
Which shouldn't be possible if consciousness is simply a product of that damaged brain hardware.
It strongly suggests consciousness can function independently of the brain's physical state, at least temporarily.
So for Lanza, like Campbell, death is.
The end of the biological organism, but not the end of awareness. Awareness shifts, transitions perhaps into a framework beyond our concepts of space and time. It's a release from the physical filter.
The sources also mention Lanza connecting this to the many worlds idea from quantum physics.
Yeah, it's an interpretation he finds compatible.
Sure.
If every quantum choice splits reality into parallel universes,
Uh-huh.
then perhaps after death in this branch, consciousness simply continues its experience in another parallel branch, another configuration of reality sustained by that awareness. Not reincarnation exactly, but a continuation.
It's striking how these two different approaches, Campbell's simulation idea and Lanza's biocentrism rooted in biology and physics, end up pointing in such a similar direction.
They really do converge on the big points. Consciousness is fundamental. Reality isn't purely physical. Death is a transition. The observer plays a critical role.
And space and time aren't the absolute stage we thought they were.
Exactly. They're more like constructs, tools, maybe part of the simulation's rule set or the mind's way of organizing things.
And it's not just these two. The sources touched on the holographic universe theory, too.
Right. Briefly mentioning work by physicist David Bohm and neuroscientist Carl Pribram, they independently suggested the universe, and maybe the brain, works kind of like a hologram.
Where the whole picture is encoded in every little part.
That's the idea. Bohm talked about our perceived reality, the explicate order, being a projection from a deeper, interconnected implicate order beyond space and time,
And Pribram's work suggested memories aren't stored locally in the brain.
but distributed holographically, yeah. So the brain itself might function like a holographic projector, or at least interface with a holographic reality.
That model could potentially explain things like the feeling of oneness in NDEs.
Possibly. If everything is interconnected at that deeper implicate level, then death might be like returning to that unified field behind the projection.
And information theory fits in here somehow.
Just the observation that at the quantum level, reality seems to behave like information. Particles have properties described by data. It fits well with an information-based system, whether you call it a simulation or something else.
It's like all these threads, physics, biology, consciousness studies, are starting to weave together, pointing towards this really different picture of reality.
Yeah, once you make that initial flip, assuming consciousness is primary, a lot of scientific paradoxes start to look less puzzling, more like clues.
Okay, so bringing this all back.
Mm.
What does this actually mean for you, listening right now, if these models hold any water?
Well, it suggests your role in existence is potentially much, much bigger than just being a temporary biological entity. This life might be just one experience, one classroom, and a much larger journey.
And death isn't the end of the road, maybe just a turn.
More like a doorway, yeah. And you're not separate from this underlying system, whatever it is. You're already in it. Your awareness is the interface.
You're not just watching the universe.
You're participating in its manifestation, in a way.
So how can you explore this personally? The sources suggest you don't have to wait for an NDE.
No, they point to things like paying attention to your intent, why you do what you do, engaging in stillness, meditation, not to escape, but to observe your own consciousness.
Looking at dreams differently, maybe.
Or just noticing patterns in your life, the recurring challenges, the feedback loops. What are they telling you about your internal state, your choices?
It's a fundamental challenge to the materialist idea that you are just your body and brain.
It suggests you're primarily the observer, the experiencer, the awareness that uses the body and brain, something more enduring.
And this life experience becomes maybe a training ground, a place to refine consciousness through choice and feedback.
That's a potential implication, yes. A process of learning and evolution.
And if space and time are constructs and death is a transition, maybe the biggest illusion of all is separation, that feeling of being cut off.
That's a profound point raised by these perspectives. Which kind of leaves us with this pretty powerful final thought from the sources to consider.
Yeah.
Maybe the real measure of this life isn't just about what happens to you, but about what you do with it, consciously. Because every choice, guided by intent, ripples through the system and shapes what comes back.
Or perhaps, simply put, the most important thing isn't figuring it all out intellectually.
But actually experiencing it, this reality, with as much awareness as you can muster.